There is a good chance the salt sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now has been stripped of almost everything it used to contain. And by the end of this video, you will know exactly what got taken out of it, how to spot the difference next time you are standing in the grocery aisle, and why something your great-grandparents used without a second thought might be worth putting back on your table. Long before factories existed, people harvested salt straight from the earth and the sea. The book of Job even speaks of that which is unsavory being eaten without salt, a sign of just how essential this mineral was considered even in ancient times. Salt was so valuable in the ancient world that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid partly in salt. That is actually where the word salary comes from. But here is the part most people never hear. The salt those soldiers carried and the salt in your shaker today are barely the same substance anymore. And the difference is not just in taste. Somewhere between then and now, salt changed. What used to be a whole, mineral-rich substance became a heavily processed product, stripped down until only one thing remained. Stick with me because in a few minutes, I will show you exactly what that one thing is, how to read a salt label, like someone who actually knows what they are looking at, and the simple swap that brings the rest of it back. Let's start with what salt actually used to be. For thousands of years, people got their salt from evaporated seawater or from mineral deposits in the earth. This wasn't a single, isolated compound. It carried dozens of trace minerals along with it: magnesium, potassium, calcium, small amounts of iron, all the things naturally found in seawater and ancient mineral beds. That's worth holding on to because it's exactly what's missing from what comes out of most shakers today. Modern table salt goes through a very different process. It is mined, then heated and refined until nearly everything except sodium chloride is removed. Anti-caking agents are often added so it flows freely from the shaker. And in some countries, iodine is added back in afterward, since the refining process strips that out too. What's left behind is far more uniform and far less like what people ate for most of human history. This kind of highly processed salt is generally associated with a less balanced mineral intake compared to less refined alternatives. And that raises a question worth sitting with for a moment. If your grandparents' salt carried all of that, what have you been missing out on your entire life without realizing it? That's really the heart of it. It's not that salt itself is the enemy. Your body genuinely needs sodium to function, and it always has. It's that the version most of us reach for today has been separated from everything it once traveled with. So what did people turn to instead, going further back? That's where this gets interesting. In many ancestral diets, unrefined salt, sometimes called rock salt or sea salt, was the only kind available. It often carried a slightly gray or pink tint, a sign of the minerals still present inside it. Traditional cultures near coastlines and salt flats use this kind of salt, not just for flavor, but as one of their only sources of trace minerals in a diet built around whole, simple foods. In the mountains of Central Europe, salt was mined from ancient seabeds that had dried up millions of years earlier, leaving behind deposits still rich in minerals today. Along the Brittany coast in France, workers have hand-harvested sea salt, the same way for centuries, using nothing but sun, wind, and shallow pools. Unrefined sea salt and rock salt are naturally higher in trace minerals like magnesium and potassium than heavily processed table salt. These are minerals many people don't get enough of today, particularly as we age and our bodies become a little less efficient at holding on to them. And the difference isn't only nutritional, it's often noticeable in the taste too. Many people who switch to unrefined salt say food simply tastes fuller, less flat than they remembered. That's not a coincidence. The trace minerals that remain in unrefined salt round out the flavor in a way pure sodium chloride never can. But taste is really just the surface of why this matters. The deeper reason has to do with something that becomes more important the older we get. As we get older, our bodies naturally become more sensitive to changes in fluid balance. And magnesium and potassium both play a quiet but important role in that balance. A diet that includes naturally mineral-rich salt, alongside whole foods like leafy greens, nuts, and beans, is generally associated with supporting that balance, not as a cure for anything, but simply as one small piece of a well-rounded pattern of eating. Now, before you picture yourself throwing out every container in your pantry, that's not what this is about. None of this means more salt is automatically better, and moderation still matters, especially for anyone managing blood pressure. What we're really talking about is quality over quantity, choosing a less processed source for the sodium you already consume, rather than adding more of it. So let us talk about how to actually tell the difference, because the grocery store aisle can be more confusing than it needs to be. Not every salt labeled sea salt is created equal, and this is where a little bit of label reading goes a long way. The first thing to look at is color. Pure white, perfectly uniform crystals are usually a sign of heavy processing, regardless of what the front of the package says. Unrefined salts tend to have some variation, a light gray tint in traditional Celtic sea salt, a soft pink in Himalayan salt, sometimes even flecks of darker mineral deposits. That variation is not a flaw. It is actually the sign you are looking for. The second thing is the ingredient list. If the only ingredient listed is salt and nothing else, that is a good sign. If you see anti-caking agents, dextrose or added iodine, as separate ingredients, that tells you it has gone through more processing. Neither is inherently dangerous, but it does mean fewer of the original trace minerals have survived. The third is texture. Unrefined salts are often a little coarser and slightly damp to the touch because they retain trace amounts of moisture along with their minerals. Heavily refined table salt, by contrast, is bone dry and pours in a perfectly even stream, which, ironically, is exactly what the anti-caking agents are there to achieve. Before we get to exactly what to look for on the shelf, it's worth pausing on just how central salt once was to daily life, because it puts today's casual throwaway relationship with it into perspective. In ancient trade routes across North Africa, salt was so valuable, it was sometimes traded pound for pound with gold. Entire cities, like Timbuktu, grew wealthy as stops along salt trading routes. In ancient Israel, salt was used in temple offerings, a symbol of something that endures and doesn't spoil. And in many cultures, sharing salt with a guest was considered a sacred act of hospitality and trust, a tradition that still echoes today in the phrase "to eat someone's salt," meaning to share a bond of loyalty. That reverence makes sense once you understand what salt actually did for people before refrigeration existed. It preserved meat and fish through long winters. It made stored food safe to eat months later. It wasn't a seasoning people reached for absent-mindedly, and it was one of the most valuable substances a household could own. It's a strange thought when you consider that today most of us have several containers of it sitting forgotten in a cupboard, worth pennies. Once you know what to look for, it becomes a lot easier to spot on the shelf. And it's worth noting that this isn't about chasing something exotic or hard to find. Sea salt and rock salt are widely available now in most grocery stores, often sitting right next to the regular table salt, usually for just a little more per container. The switch itself is simple. You don't need to overhaul your whole kitchen. Next time your table salt runs low, replace it with an unrefined sea salt or rock salt instead. Use it exactly the way you'd use regular salt, same shaker, same recipe, same amount. It's a small, quiet swap, not a big lifestyle change. One thing worth mentioning, since it comes up often, if you currently use iodized table salt, specifically for the iodine, switching to an unrefined salt without added iodine means you'd want to get that iodine elsewhere. Foods like fish, dairy, and eggs are natural sources. That's a conversation worth having with your doctor if it applies to you, since individual needs vary. Now, if you've spent years hearing that salt is something to fear, this next part matters. A lot of the concern around salt in modern health advice comes from studies on excessive sodium intake, especially from processed and packaged foods, where sodium is often hidden in large amounts alongside preservatives and sugar. That's a very different picture from someone lightly salting a home-cooked meal with a mineral-rich, unrefined salt. The conversation about sodium and blood pressure is real and worth taking seriously, which is exactly why moderation and a conversation with your doctor matter here, especially if you're already managing blood pressure. But it's also worth understanding that not all salt and not all sources of sodium tell the same story. This is really the quiet theme running through so much of what we cover on this channel. It's rarely about a single ingredient being good or bad. It's about which version of that ingredient you're reaching for and how it was made. Salt is a small, everyday example of a much bigger pattern. Let's come back to where we started. The salt on most tables today has been stripped of nearly everything except sodium chloride, while the salt our ancestors relied on for thousands of years, from Roman soldiers to coastal salt harvesters, carried a whole spectrum of trace minerals along with it. That one difference, small as it seems, reflects a much larger pattern in how far our foods has drifted from its original form, and it's a pattern we're going to keep uncovering, one ordinary kitchen staple at a time. If there's one thing to take from today, let it be this: sometimes going back to something simpler is its own kind of progress. This video is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. This does not replace treatment prescribed by your doctor. Always consult your doctor before making dietary or lifestyle changes, especially if you are managing blood pressure, thyroid concerns, or any other health condition. If this kind of gentle, ancestral wisdom speaks to you, consider subscribing, because next time we are looking at the one ancient morning habit that quietly replaced the modern cup of coffee for centuries, and what it might mean for your energy today. We would love to have you along.